He thought she was stealing. He decided to follow her after work, but what he saw made him realize the truth. T, subscribe and write in the comments what you would do in his place and what city you're watching from. Graham Wellington's mornings always began before dawn, the world outside still cloaked in a deep, cold quiet that matched the emptiness of the house he called home. The mansion was perched on the slopes above the city, with glass walls that displayed the skyline like a framed painting he never bothered to look at anymore. Every room was curated to perfection, art pieces aligned with surgical precision, floors polished to the point where even a speck of dust felt like an offense against the order he had built around himself. Each piece of furniture had been chosen for its simplicity and function, the muted colors a reflection of the man who lived among them. It was a world of silence, a fortress Graham had constructed to protect himself from the chaos that people brought, a fortress that had become his cage. His routine was his religion. Coffee, ground precisely, brewed exactly at the right temperature, poured into the same gray ceramic mug that never left a ring on the counters because he always used a coaster. The television would play business news in the background, the voices reporting fluctuations in the markets, the rise and fall of tech stocks, the anticipation of the opening bell, all merging into a hum that calmed the restless edge that hovered under Graham's skin. He liked numbers, the certainty they brought, the promise that logic would always prevail where emotions could not. The markets were honest, people were not. He had learned that lesson early, the day his parents' car was pulled from the river, mangled and cold, the bodies of the only people he trusted taken away under sheets, while men whispered about the inheritance left to a boy too young to understand what it meant. Relatives came, speaking of love and family, eyes darting toward the trust fund documents, the land deeds, and the accounts that held the promise of a future they could not touch. He learned then that everyone wanted something, and that kindness often came with an invoice hidden in the folds of sympathy. Years later, as he built his own empire, brick by careful brick, he kept that lesson close. Business partners became enemies over a fraction of percentages. Women who claimed to love him slipped jewelry into their purses, whispered secrets to others, and smiled while lying through their teeth. He learned to stop letting people close, learned to stop listening to the warmth in voices or the softness in eyes, and instead trusted the background checks, the security cameras, the contracts, and the locks on his doors. Control was the only form of safety he understood, and he applied it to every aspect of his life. The house was cleaned meticulously every morning before Graham began his workday, and that responsibility belonged to Kayla. She was young, likely around 28, with a soft presence that moved through the house like a breeze, touching everything lightly before disappearing without leaving a mark. She arrived precisely at 7 each morning, wearing plain clothes, her hair pulled back neatly, her movements efficient and quiet. She never tried to start conversations beyond the polite greetings, never lingered in rooms she had finished cleaning, never disrupted the quiet that Graham prized above all else. But Graham noticed everything. He noticed the way she paused sometimes, placing a hand on her lower back as if easing a pain she would not acknowledge. He noticed the way her eyes lingered on the cityscape beyond the glass, a longing crossing her face before she tucked it away behind the polite nods she gave him. He noticed that she sometimes left 15 or 20 minutes early, giving excuses about needing to catch a bus or an appointment, her voice soft, careful, like she was afraid to take up space. And he noticed the bags she carried out with her, bags that seemed heavier on some days, her arms straining as she hurried down the driveway toward the bus stop. It was on one of those mornings that Graham heard her on the phone, her voice hushed, the conversation in a language he did not understand, but with words that sounded sharp, anxious. He caught fragments in English, words like payment and food, and his mind, trained to anticipate betrayal, began to fill in the blanks with the worst possible explanations. It was not the first time he had been stolen from by someone who seemed harmless. The last housekeeper, Jennifer, had been sweet, smiling as she cleaned the silver, only to disappear one morning along with his grandmother's jewelry, a betrayal that still felt like a bruise under his ribs. He could not let himself fall into the illusion of safety. Not again. He began to watch Kayla more closely, observing the small inconsistencies in her routine, the tension in her shoulders as she moved from room to room, the way she avoided meeting his eyes when she left for the day. He started to check the pantry, the wine cellar, the closets, making sure nothing was missing, reassuring himself with the order of things that calmed his unease. But the suspicion grew, fed by the silence of the house, the echo of his footsteps as he walked through rooms too large for one man. At night, Graham lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, the shadows from the city lights creeping across the walls, the hush of the house pressing down on him. The silence that had once been his sanctuary now felt like it was mocking him, reminding him of the emptiness he had chosen in exchange for control. He told himself it was necessary, that people would only hurt him if he let them in, that his suspicions were justified. But deep down, under the layers of rationalizations and cold logic, there was a whisper of doubt, a question that echoed in the darkness. What if he was wrong? But fear was stronger than doubt. The fear of losing control, of being taken advantage of being made a fool of in his own home, was a fear that Graham could not allow himself to ignore. And so, when he saw Kayla leaving early again one Thursday, clutching that heavy bag, her eyes downcast, her steps quick as if she were running from something, Graham made a decision. He would follow her, watch her, discover the truth for himself, no matter what that truth turned out to be. The next morning, Graham planned his day carefully. He canceled meetings under the guise of needing a work-from-home day, informed his assistant he was not to be disturbed, and spent the morning checking the cameras in the house, tracking Kayla's movements as she worked through her routine. She cleaned efficiently, as always, wiping down surfaces, arranging cushions, her presence quiet, purposeful, almost invisible if not for the way Graham's eyes followed her every move. She paused once at the window, looking out at the city, her expression unreadable, before turning back to her tasks, finishing earlier than usual. She washed her hands, packed her bag, and slipped out the door, the quiet click of it closing behind her sounding louder in the silence that followed. Graham moved quickly, locking the house and getting into his car, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind sharp, focused. He told himself it was necessary, that he was protecting himself, his property, his life, that it was better to know than to be betrayed again. But as he pulled out of the driveway, following the bus that Kayla boarded down the winding streets, there was a tightness in his chest that he could not explain, a tension that felt different from the cold suspicion he was accustomed to. It was something closer to fear, but not the fear of betrayal, fear of what he might discover about himself if he was wrong. The bus moved slowly through the city, stopping at intersections, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the streets, the people moving in patterns Graham usually ignored. He stayed several cars back, watching through the windshield as the bus continued into a part of the city Graham rarely entered. The buildings older, the sidewalks cracked, the signs and languages he did not speak. It was a world away from the glass and steel of his fortress on the hill, a world he had spent his life avoiding, a world he believed was filled with people who would take what they could get, who would smile as they did it. When the bus stopped and Kayla stepped off, her bag still heavy in her arms, Graham parked down the block, turning off the engine, watching as she adjusted the strap on her shoulder and started walking, her steps quick, purposeful. She moved through the streets with familiarity, greeting a few people with a nod, a small smile, before reaching a building with faded paint, a sign above the door that Graham could barely read from where he sat. It was old, tired, the windows covered in papers and notices, the door worn from use. Kayla paused before the door, shifting the bag in her arms, taking a breath before pushing it open and stepping inside. Graham watched, waiting, his mind racing with possibilities, with the stories he had told himself about what he would find, the suspicion, the certainty that she was hiding something, that she was using him, that she was just another person waiting to take advantage of the softness he had long buried surged within him. But as the minutes passed, as he sat there in the silence of his car, watching the door she had disappeared behind, there was a small part of him, deep and quiet, that hoped he was wrong. That hoped for something he could not name, something that would break the monotony of his fortress, something that would give meaning to the silence he had built around himself. The sun was beginning to set, the sky painted in shades of pink and gold, the lights of the city flickering on one by one, as Graham sat there, waiting, watching, preparing himself for the truth that would change everything he thought he knew. He did not know then that the fortress he had built would begin to crumble, not from betrayal, but from the quiet presence of a woman who had walked into his life without asking for anything but the chance to keep her own promises to the world. He did not know that the fear that had governed his life would soon be replaced by something far more terrifying and infinitely more beautiful: hope. He only knew that the moment he decided to follow her was the moment his carefully controlled world began to crack, letting in the first fragile light of something that felt like freedom. And as the last light of day faded, leaving him in the glow of the street lights, Graham took a deep breath and prepared to leave the safety of suspicion, ready or not, to discover who Kayla truly was. The sun had dipped below the city's jagged skyline, the deepening dusk casting long shadows that swallowed the cracked sidewalks and flickering street lights one by one as Graham sat in his car, the engine quiet, the interior cloaked in the fading glow of day. The quiet of his vehicle felt like an extension of the mansion he had left behind, sterile and still, the leather seats unmarked, the faint scent of polished surfaces mingling with the cool air that seeped in through the cracked window. He watched the door of the building Kayla had entered, the faded sign above it creaking lightly in the evening breeze, the windows glowing softly from within like beacons in the gloom of the street. He could see shapes moving inside, silhouettes crossing the thin curtains, shadows cast against the glass that shifted and danced in the uncertain light. He felt the weight of the day in his shoulders, the heaviness of the decision he had made to follow her, to abandon the safety of his fortress and step into a world he had carefully avoided. The world outside his car felt foreign, the crumbling sidewalks, the laughter of children echoing in the alley, the distant music from a nearby shop mingling with the hum of traffic, all a stark contrast to the silence he had wrapped himself in for years. But there was something in that unfamiliar chaos that tugged at the edges of his mind, a reminder of a life that might have existed had he not chosen isolation, had he not chosen suspicion as his shield. Graham's eyes fixed on the door as it opened, letting out a waft of warm air tinged with the scent of food, The laughter of children spilling out into the street before the door closed again, the glow dimming slightly. He could see Kayla moving inside, her figure small but steady, her movements sure as she carried her bag deeper into the building, disappearing from view as she turned a corner. He felt a surge of frustration at the walls that blocked his vision, his need for control itching under his skin, a restless energy that made his fingers tap lightly against the steering wheel as he considered what to do next. The minutes stretched, time measured only by the rhythmic glow of the neon sign in the window and the slow crawl of headlights passing by. Each moment was filled with the quiet hum of his thoughts, the questions he could not silence pressing into him like a weight. Why did she leave early? What was she hiding in those bags? What was she doing in a place like this when she could have been using her time to rest, to do what normal people did after work, instead of walking into a building that looked ready to collapse under the weight of its own history? Driven by a restlessness he could no longer ignore, Graham stepped out of his car, the door closing softly behind him, the chill of the evening air biting at the edges of his collar. The street felt different from behind glass, the sounds sharper, the smells stronger, the lights harsher in the darkening evening. He adjusted the cuffs of his coat, his shoes clicking lightly against the uneven pavement as he approached the building, each step a careful, measured decision to draw closer to the truth he believed he needed. Through the dirt-streaked window, he could see more clearly now, the condensation on the glass catching the light from inside, casting blurry halos around the faces and bodies moving within. There were children seated on folding chairs, small backpacks at their feet, their eyes focused on Kayla as she moved among them, her hands gesturing as she spoke, a smile on her face that was different from the polite, closed expressions she wore in his home. It was a smile that reached her eyes, that lifted the edges of her lips in a way that softened the lines of weariness he had seen etched into her face during the early mornings at the mansion. She was unpacking the contents of her bag onto a table now, placing loaves of bread, small containers of fruit, packets of crackers, and bottles of water into neat rows, her movements precise but gentle, the children's eyes lighting up as they watched her. A small boy reached for an apple, his eyes wide, his fingers hesitant, and Kayla laughed, nudging it toward him with a nod, her body language open and welcoming in a way Graham had never seen in her before. There was an ease to her movements, a softness in the way she crouched to speak to a little girl who clung to the edge of a chair, showing her something in a workbook, guiding her hand as she traced letters on a page. The room was filled with people, older men and women seated along the walls, some holding papers and pencils, others simply watching, their faces lined with years of work and quiet endurance, their eyes following Kayla as she moved through the room, pausing to greet each of them, her hand resting on a shoulder here, a reassuring touch on a forearm there. There was a warmth in the room that Graham could feel even through the cold glass, a sense of community that pulsed softly, a shared, quiet joy that came from the small acts of care Kayla seemed to offer so easily. He felt something strange then, something unfamiliar and uncomfortable, a tightness in his chest that made him take a step back, the cold air filling his lungs as he tried to steady himself. The suspicion that had driven him here began to unravel, fraying at the edges as he watched her laugh, watched her help a child open a juice box, watched her gather the group around as she opened a book, pointing to the pictures and words, her voice rising and falling in a gentle rhythm that seemed to calm even the most restless of the children. The minutes slipped by unnoticed, the street lights humming above him, the occasional car passing with a rush of wind that ruffled his hair. But Graham could not pull himself away. There was something about the way she moved in that space, something about the way she existed in that room that held him rooted to the spot, his eyes following her every movement as if he were seeing her for the first time. This was not the Kayla who moved silently through his house, careful not to disturb the order he demanded, her presence a ghostly echo in the vastness of his rooms. This was a woman who belonged somewhere, who was needed, whose presence filled a space with warmth and purpose. It dawned on him, slowly, painfully, that he had misjudged her, that his fear and suspicion had blinded him to the truth of who she was. The image he had constructed of her, a potential thief, a liar, someone who was taking advantage of his kindness, began to crumble under the weight of what he saw before him. He felt the bitterness of shame rising in his throat, the taste of regret sharp and cutting as he realized that in his efforts to protect himself, he had been blind to the quiet heroism of someone who asked for nothing and gave everything. As the evening deepened, the children began to gather their things, slipping on worn jackets and backpacks, some hugging Kayla before they left, their small arms wrapping around her waist, their faces buried against her as she smiled, her hand brushing their hair back from their faces. The older people filed out slowly, some pausing to thank her, their hands clasping hers in gratitude, their faces softening in the glow of the doorway before they disappeared into the night. Kayla remained, cleaning up the room, gathering the empty juice boxes and snack wrappers, wiping down the tables, her movements unhurried, a quiet contentment in the way she moved through the space. Graham watched her as she finally sat down on one of the chairs, her shoulders slumping for a moment, her hands resting in her lap as she closed her eyes, taking a breath that seemed to carry the weight of the day in it. The expression on her face was one of exhaustion, but also of peace, a quiet fulfillment that Graham could not understand but felt drawn to with a pull that frightened him. He turned away then, the noise of the street washing over him as he walked back to his car, his steps slow, deliberate, the world around him shifting in ways he could not yet name. The drive home was silent, the lights of the city blurring past as he stared ahead, his hands steady on the wheel, but his mind adrift with thoughts that refused to settle. The mansion greeted him with its usual silence, the doors closing behind him with a soft finality that once brought comfort but now felt oppressive. Inside, the familiar order of his world was unchanged, the surfaces gleaming, the air still and cold, the lights casting clean, sharp lines across the floors and walls. But to Graham, everything felt different now. The silence louder, the emptiness more profound, the perfection of the space a stark reminder of the absence of the warmth he had witnessed in that small, crowded room. He moved through the house, each step echoing, the sound a reminder of the isolation he had chosen, the fortress he had built to protect himself from the world, now feeling like a prison of his own making. He found himself standing at the window, looking out over the city, the lights stretching into the distance, a sea of possibility he had long ignored in favor of the safety of control. The memory of Kayla's smile, the sound of her laughter, the way she had looked as she knelt beside a child to guide a small hand over a page filled his mind, pushing away the numbers and graphs that usually occupied his thoughts. For the first time in a long while, Graham felt the weight of his choices pressing into him, the realization that in trying to protect himself, he had cut himself off from the very things that made life worth living. Sleep did not come easily that night, the images of the evening replaying in his mind, the warmth of that room a stark contrast to the coldness of his bed, the quiet of his house a heavy silence that pressed into him until the early hours of the morning. He rose before dawn, as was his habit, but the routine felt empty now. The coffee bitter on his tongue, the news a meaningless hum in the background as he stood in the kitchen, staring at the floor, the memory of Kayla's tired but contented face haunting him. He had followed her in suspicion, certain he would find betrayal, prepared to confront her, to remove her from his life before she could take something from him. Instead, he had found a truth that shook the foundations of his carefully constructed world, a truth that left him with questions he could not yet answer, with feelings he did not know how to name. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the city, painting the sky in pale hues that promised a new day, Graham realized that he could not return to the way things were, that the fortress he had built was no longer enough, that something had shifted within him, quietly but irrevocably, the moment he had chosen to follow Kayla into the unknown. Morning came with a cold drizzle that streaked the tall windows of Graham's home, the rain tapping against the glass in a steady, quiet rhythm as the city outside began to stir. He stood in the kitchen, his hands wrapped around his mug, staring out at the gray sky, watching as droplets traced crooked paths down the panes before gathering at the bottom in trembling beads. The warmth of the coffee did nothing to soothe the chill that had settled inside him, a persistent unease that had taken root since the night he had followed Kayla. The fortress of silence he had built for himself felt different now, the edges of its walls somehow sharper, the hush that had once brought comfort now echoing with an emptiness that pressed on his chest each time he tried to take a deep breath. The image of her lingered in his mind, refusing to be pushed away by the demands of his routine. He saw her crouched beside that small child, her hand guiding the pencil across the page with patient care, the gentle encouragement in her eyes, the way her smile had lit up her face, transforming her from the quiet, near-invisible presence in his home into someone alive with purpose. He saw the older women who had grasped her hands, their eyes filled with gratitude, the children who clung to her with unguarded affection, the way she moved in that room with quiet authority, each action deliberate and full of care. These were images he could not reconcile with the cautious woman who entered his home each morning, never meeting his eyes for long, never speaking more than necessary, leaving each day as quietly as she arrived. He found himself standing in front of the security system that lined the hallway to his office, the small screens displaying feeds from each room in his house, the cameras he had installed as his insurance against betrayal, against the chaos of others seeping into his controlled world. His fingers hovered over the controls, and for a moment he considered turning them off, removing the eyes that had allowed him to observe without truly seeing, to watch without truly understanding. Instead, he keyed in the sequence that would pull up the footage from the days and weeks prior, each room illuminated on the screens, each movement captured in grainy, clinical clarity. There was Kayla, moving quietly through his home, her footsteps light, her presence barely a disturbance in the stillness of each space. She wiped down the counters, adjusted the pillows on the sofas, swept the floors, her movements efficient and precise, leaving each room immaculate before moving on to the next. He watched as she paused once at the window in the living room, the city stretched out below her, the light catching in her dark eyes as she seemed to lose herself for a moment before turning back to her work, her shoulders drawn in, the soft sigh she released almost visible in the stillness of the room. There was nothing in these recordings that suggested theft, nothing that spoke of betrayal, nothing that aligned with the suspicions that had driven him to follow her. He moved to his office, sitting at the heavy desk, the monitors still flickering in the corner, the images of Kayla moving through his home like a ghost replaying over and over. He reached for his laptop, pulling up the notes he had taken, the background check he had ordered before hiring her, the neat lines of data that confirmed what he already knew. Kayla had no criminal record, no debts that indicated desperation, no connections to people who might pressure her into wrongdoing. Her file was clean, too clean, he had once thought, certain it was a sign she was hiding something, that the careful neatness of her life was a mask for something darker. Now he saw it differently. The gaps in her record no longer points of suspicion, but questions that tugged at his curiosity, drawing him toward an understanding he was not yet ready to fully embrace. Among the papers on his desk, Graham found the receipt he had pulled from her jacket pocket the week before, when she had left it draped over a chair in the entryway while she scrubbed the tiles. At the time, he had pocketed it without thinking, just another piece of evidence to add to his growing file of suspicions. Now he smoothed it out on the desk, the ink smudged but still legible. A money transfer, $500 sent to Honduras, the name of the recipient unfamiliar to him, the small note in the corner indicating it was for medical expenses. At the time, he had assumed it was a lie, a cover for something else, another manipulation. Now, the memory of her tired face, the exhaustion that she tried to hide under a careful smile, the quiet resolve in her movements as she handed out food and notebooks in that small room, all came back to him, overlaying his assumptions with a painful clarity. Graham leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, letting the memory of the previous evening wash over him in pieces he could not ignore. The laughter of the children, the gratitude in the eyes of the elders, the way Kayla's entire being seemed to come alive in that room, her small acts of care rippling outward, touching each person with a kindness he had not known could exist so quietly, so steadfastly. It was a stark contrast to the coldness of his life, the transactions and negotiations, the endless deals that brought him wealth but never satisfaction, the isolation that had become both his protection and his prison. He opened his eyes, looking around the office, the dark wood, the gleaming surfaces, the meticulously organized shelves, each item in its place, untouched by anyone but him. It was a world of order, a world of control, a world that had cost him every chance at warmth, at connection, at the messy, unpredictable humanity he saw in Kayla. For years, he had told himself it was worth it, that it was better to be alone than to be betrayed, that control was worth more than companionship, that wealth was worth more than trust. But sitting there, the images of Kayla's kindness and purpose playing in his mind, he felt the emptiness of those choices with a clarity that cut deeper than he was prepared for. His gaze shifted to the photograph on the corner of his desk, the only personal item he allowed in this space. A picture of his mother, her hands in the soil of their small garden, her face turned toward him with a tired but warm smile, dirt smudged on her cheek, the sun catching in her hair. She had worked hard her entire life, cleaning houses, taking in laundry, doing whatever she could to keep them fed and sheltered after his father had left. She had dreamed of a different life for him, one where he would not have to work with his hands, one where he would be respected and secure, safe from the struggles she faced every day. He had achieved that, and more. But in the process, he had lost the part of himself that could find joy in small things, that could see value in people beyond what they could take from him or give to him. The memory of her came back with a sharpness that made him close his eyes, remembering the way she had pressed a sandwich into his hands before school, the way she had hummed softly while folding laundry, the way her hands, rough from work, had held his face gently when she told him she was proud of him. She had given everything for him, and in his pursuit of security, he had built a life that honored her sacrifices in wealth but betrayed them in spirit. Watching Kayla, he had seen that same quiet strength, that same willingness to give without asking for anything in return, that same dignity in the face of hardship. It was a reminder of what he had lost, of what he had chosen to leave behind in his pursuit of safety. The day passed slowly, each hour marked by the quiet tick of the clock on the wall, the muted hum of the city beyond the glass. Graham found himself moving through his home, the silence following him like a shadow, the emptiness of each room a stark contrast to the warmth he had witnessed in that small, crowded building the night before. He stood at the window, looking down at the city, the people moving through the streets below, each with their own lives, their own struggles, their own moments of quiet joy and sorrow, a world he had shut himself off from for so long. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of that choice pressing into him, the realization that his fortress had become a prison, not just of walls and locks, but of fear and suspicion, of a loneliness so profound he had convinced himself it was freedom. That evening, as the lights of the city began to twinkle against the deepening dusk, Graham sat at his desk once more, the receipt from Kayla's pocket in front of him, the memory of her laughter, her kindness, the way she had smiled at those children, filling the room with a warmth he could almost feel. He opened his laptop, pulling up the website for the center she volunteered at, reading through the sparse information, the photos of community gatherings, the lists of needed donations, the testimonials from families who had found help and hope within its walls. It was a small place, struggling to stay open, operating month to month, the weight of its mission carried on the shoulders of volunteers like Kayla, who gave what little they had to keep it alive. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, the cursor blinking in the donation field, the amount empty, waiting. He thought of his mother, of Kayla, of the children who had laughed and learned under her guidance, of the elders who had held her hands with gratitude, of the warmth and purpose that had filled that room, of the emptiness of his own life, the cold precision that had brought him wealth but stolen from him the simple, profound joy of connection. He typed in an amount, enough to keep the center open for months, enough to ease the burden Kayla carried alone, enough to give something back to a world he had taken so much from without giving in return. As he clicked the confirmation button, watching the screen acknowledge the transfer, a strange feeling washed over him, a lightness he had not felt in years, a warmth that spread through his chest, loosening something that had been wound tight for far too long. It was not charity, he realized, not really, not in the way he had once viewed giving as a transaction, a way to polish his image or ease a guilty conscience. It was something different, something that felt like a small step toward the man his mother had hoped he would become, something that felt like the first crack in the walls he had built around his heart. That night, the silence of his home felt different, softer, the shadows less oppressive, the emptiness less sharp. He sat by the window, watching the city lights blink and glow, thinking of Kayla, of the way she had carried herself with quiet dignity, of the way she had given so much without asking for anything in return, of the way she had unknowingly shown him a different way to live. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Graham felt the stirrings of hope, fragile but persistent. A promise that it was not too late to change, not too late to step out from behind the walls he had built, not too late to become someone who could give without fear, who could care without suspicion, who could find meaning and connection instead of isolation. As he closed his eyes, the image of Kayla's smile, the sound of children's laughter, the warmth of that small room filled with people finding hope in the darkness stayed with him, a reminder that the woman he had thought he knew was so much more, and that in discovering who she truly was, he had begun to discover himself as well. The morning after Graham made the anonymous donation to the community center arrived with an unusual softness, the light seeping through the tall windows and pale bands that stretched across the polished floors of his home. He stood in the kitchen, holding his coffee, staring into the steam as it rose in slow curls, his mind unable to settle on the tasks that would usually fill his thoughts at this hour. The click of the clock on the wall, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the muted sounds of the city wakened beyond the glass, all felt different, as if the world had shifted by a fraction, unnoticeable to most, but undeniable to him. He replayed the memory of the night before, the moment he pressed the confirmation on the donation, the way the screen had flashed with the acknowledgement, the strange, almost fragile warmth that had settled in his chest. It was not the satisfaction he felt after closing a deal or the measured pleasure of a successful investment, but something softer, quieter, something that made him feel unexpectedly human in a life that had been carved down to numbers and efficiency. The act had been simple, a transaction completed in a few seconds, but it had carried a weight that seemed to echo through the silence of his home. Graham found himself standing at the window again, the city laid out before him under the gray morning light, the streets alive with people moving, each carrying their stories, their struggles, their small victories and defeats. For years he had viewed them as noise, a chaos best kept at bay by the glass and steel of his fortress, their lives irrelevant to his carefully measured existence. But now, as he watched the figures below, he found himself wondering about them, about the stories hidden behind hurried steps and tired eyes, about the quiet acts of resilience that went unnoticed each day. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of the front door opening, the careful, measured steps of Kayla as she entered, her presence as quiet as ever, her movements efficient and unobtrusive as she set down her bag and began her work. He listened to the familiar sounds of her cleaning, the gentle sweep of the broom, the quiet clink of dishes being placed back into their places, the soft rustle of cloth as she wiped down surfaces. It was the same routine she had followed since the day she started, but to Graham it felt different now, layered with the memory of who she truly was outside these walls, the quiet strength and purpose she carried with her into every room she entered. He found himself moving through the house, drifting from room to room, pretending to check on things that did not need checking, just to be near her, to watch the way she moved, the small frown of concentration as she adjusted a vase or straightened a frame, the way her eyes softened when she looked out the window for a moment before returning to her work. He noticed how tired she looked, the faint shadows under her eyes, the slight slump in her shoulders when she thought no one was watching, the quiet sighs that slipped from her lips as she moved through the silence of the house. He wondered if she knew the donation had arrived yet, if she had allowed herself to feel relief, to feel the burden lift, even if only a little. Unable to contain his curiosity, Graham returned to his office, pulling up the website of the community center, scrolling through its modest updates, searching for any sign that his donation had made its way to them. He found a short post, a few lines thanking an anonymous donor for their generosity, mentioning that the funds would allow them to continue their programs without interruption, that they would be able to purchase supplies, cover the rent for the next few months, provide meals for those who needed them most. There was no mention of Kayla, but he could imagine her smile, the way her eyes would light up, the quiet relief that would ease the lines of worry from her face, even if just for a moment. That thought stayed with him as he moved through the day, accompanying him through calls and meetings. The numbers and charts that once demanded his full attention now blurred and unimportant against the image of her smile. The memory of her laughter in that small room, surrounded by children and elders who looked at her with gratitude and trust. He found himself distracted, his mind drifting to thoughts of what else he could do, how else he could help without revealing himself, without shattering the fragile distance that allowed him to observe without being truly seen. When Kayla left that afternoon, her departure as quiet as her arrival, Graham found himself standing at the window, watching as she walked down the driveway, her bag slung over her shoulder, her steps steady but tired. He felt an impulse to call out to her, to offer her a ride, to say something that would break the silence between them, but he remained still, his hand pressed against the cold glass, the words caught in his throat, unspoken. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, one that Graham found himself craving in a way that both unsettled and comforted him. Each morning, he listened for the soft sound of the door, the quiet steps that signaled her arrival, each day finding small excuses to remain in the house while she worked, to linger in the kitchen while she cleaned the counters, to step into the hallway under the pretense of checking his messages while she vacuumed, to be near the quiet warmth she brought with her into the sterile rooms of his home. He began to notice things he had never seen before. The way she would pause to look at the photographs on the shelves, her eyes lingering on the images of landscapes from his travels, her lips curving into the faintest smile when she saw the photograph of his mother in the garden. He noticed the way she moved with care, treating each object with respect, as if understanding that these small details were pieces of the life he had constructed for himself, pieces that, until now, had gone unnoticed even by him. One afternoon, as she was finishing up in the living room, Graham found himself speaking before he could stop himself, his voice cutting through the quiet in a way that made her pause, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of surprise and caution. He asked her how she was, a simple question, but one he had never asked before, the words feeling strange and unfamiliar on his tongue. She hesitated, her hands tightening on the cloth she was holding, before nodding and offering a polite response, her eyes dropping back to her work, the distance between them reasserting itself as quickly as it had been broken. But the moment lingered, the small fracture in their routine becoming a point of quiet significance that Graham could not ignore. He found himself asking again the next day and the day after, each time receiving a short, careful answer, but each time noticing the way her eyes would soften, the way her shoulders would ease, even if just slightly, as if the simple act of being acknowledged brought her a moment of relief. He began to learn small details about her life, pieces that slipped through in her cautious responses. The mention of her mother, the hint of a long commute, the way she carefully managed her time to balance her work and her commitments outside of it. He listened, collecting each piece with a care he had never shown for anyone before, each detail painting a fuller picture of the woman he had once seen only as a potential threat, each piece a quiet testament to her strength, her resilience, her quiet dedication to something beyond herself. In the evenings, Graham would find himself seated at his desk, the lights of the city glittering outside the windows, the darkness pressing gently against the glass as he thought of her, of the life she led outside his home, of the people she helped, of the quiet kindness she offered without expectation of return. He thought of the children who looked at her with trust, of the elders who held her hands with gratitude, of the warmth she carried with her, a warmth that had begun to thaw the cold edges of his carefully constructed world. The fortress he had built around himself, the walls of suspicion and control, had begun to crack. The quiet presence of Kayla in his home, in his thoughts, in the corners of his life, forcing him to see what he had chosen to ignore for so long. He began to realize that his wealth, his success, the control he prized above all else, had not protected him from the loneliness that had crept into every part of his life, that the safety he had built for himself had come at the cost of connection, of warmth, of the simple, human need to care and be cared for in return. Late one evening, unable to sleep, Graham found himself scrolling through the website of the community center again, reading the small updates, the notes of thanks from families, the announcements of new programs they hoped to start if they could secure the funding. He read about the children learning to read, the elders practicing English, the small victories that marked their days, each line a testament to the quiet, persistent hope that Kayla had dedicated herself to nurturing. He realized, with a clarity that left him breathless, that he wanted to be part of that hope, not as an outsider offering anonymous support, but as someone willing to step beyond the walls he had built, willing to let himself be seen, to let himself care. He wanted to help, not because it was a transaction, not because it would polish his image, but because he had seen what it meant, had felt the warmth of it, had witnessed the quiet, transformative power of kindness in the simplest of acts. As dawn approached, the first light creeping across the floor, Graham made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. He would continue to help the center, to support the work Kayla was doing, but he would do so openly, honestly, letting her know that she was not alone in her mission, that she did not have to carry the weight of it by herself. He would find a way to tell her, to step beyond the safety of silence, to offer not just his resources, but his willingness to stand beside her, to be part of something real, something good. As the city woke beyond his windows, Graham felt the shift within himself, the quiet, undeniable movement from suspicion to trust, from isolation to connection, from fear to hope. It was a beginning, fragile and uncertain, but it was enough to make him believe that change was possible, that the life he had built did not have to remain a fortress, that it could become something more, something warmer, something worth sharing with someone who had unknowingly shown him the path back to himself. Morning arrived with a fragile promise of spring in the air, though the sky remained pale and hesitant above the city. Graham found himself awake before dawn again, standing by the window as the first streaks of light began to color the edges of the horizon. The city below stirred slowly, headlights cutting through the last traces of night, buses collecting passengers bundled in coats, coffee shops flickering awake one neon sign at a time. He watched the world move from the silence of his home, a cup of coffee in his hand grown cold, untouched as he held it loosely, his mind occupied by the conversation he knew he would have to face, a conversation that frightened him in ways nothing in his carefully controlled life ever had. The days since his decision had unfolded with an unfamiliar quiet, a waiting that pressed into him with each hour that passed. Kayla continued to arrive each morning with the same soft steps and unobtrusive presence, moving through the house with her quiet efficiency, the scent of clean linen and lemon soap following in her wake as she worked. Yet, Graham could see the difference in the way he watched her now, no longer as a figure to monitor, no longer as a potential threat, but as a person who had become an anchor in the unsteady shifting of his world. A presence he found himself depending on in ways he had never allowed himself to depend on anyone before. He watched her sometimes when she paused by the window, the morning light catching in her hair, her eyes focused on something far beyond the cityscape, a softness in her expression that spoke of longing, of dreams she carried quietly, tucked away beneath the layer of resilience she wore like armor. He wondered about those dreams, about the life she lived outside the hours she spent in his home, about the burden she shouldered alone while still finding it in herself to give to others without hesitation. Each day, the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a space waiting to be filled, a space Graham found himself longing to cross. One afternoon, as she dusted the shelves in his study, her eyes lingering briefly on the photograph of his mother in the garden, Graham found himself speaking before he could reconsider, his voice softer than he intended, asking her about her family. She turned to look at him, surprise crossing her features before she lowered her eyes, her hands pausing in their work as she held the cloth between her fingers. She spoke quietly then, words measured, telling him about her mother, about the small home they shared when she first arrived in the country, about the illness that had taken most of their savings, about the long nights working in cleaning jobs and grocery stores to cover the bills and still send money back home for medicine. She spoke with a calm acceptance, a quiet dignity that made Graham's chest tighten, the reality of her life so different from his, yet carried with such strength that it humbled him. He listened, truly listened, and in that moment, something within him settled, the constant hum of suspicion and guardedness quieting in the face of her honesty. He found himself sharing in return, telling her about his mother, about the way she worked endlessly to keep them afloat, about the car accident that took her away before she could see the life he built, about the promise he made to himself that he would never be vulnerable again, that he would never allow himself to depend on anyone, that he would build a life so secure that no one could ever hurt him. As he spoke, he realized how hollow those words sounded now, how empty that promise had become, how it had cost him every chance at warmth and connection. Kayla stood there, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment there was no employer and employee, no rich man and cleaning woman, only two people who understood the weight of sacrifice, the loneliness of carrying burdens in silence, the fear of letting others in. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, before returning to her work. But Graham saw the softening in her shoulders, the way her movements lost some of their cautious distance, the way the room felt warmer in the wake of the conversation they had shared. That evening, as the city lights began to flicker against the darkening sky, Graham found himself unable to focus on the reports and emails that filled his screen. The numbers and charts that once held his attention now felt meaningless, the glow of the monitor harsh against the thoughts that crowded his mind. He closed the laptop, standing and moving through the silent house, each step echoing against the polished floors, the emptiness of the rooms pressing in on him with a weight he could no longer ignore. He found himself in the living room, standing by the photograph of his mother, the image of her smile a reminder of everything he had lost in his pursuit of control. He thought of Kayla, of the life she lived, of the quiet strength she carried with her, of the way she found purpose in helping others despite the struggles she faced. He thought of the community center, of the children who gathered there, of the elders who found comfort in learning, of the small, fragile hope that place represented, a hope that he had touched only briefly, enough to know that it was something real, something worth protecting. The decision came to him then, not as a sharp realization, but as a quiet certainty, a truth he could no longer deny. He would help the center, not with anonymous donations hidden behind layers of transactions, but openly, honestly, as a partner in the mission Kayla had dedicated herself to, as someone willing to step out from behind the walls he had built, willing to use what he had to support something that mattered, something that brought light into the dark spaces of the world. The next morning, Graham found himself waiting in the kitchen when Kayla arrived, her steps pausing as she saw him standing there, the soft surprise in her eyes quickly hidden behind the professional calm she always wore. He asked her to sit with him for a moment, to share a cup of coffee before she began her work, the invitation hanging in the air between them, a moment of uncertainty before she nodded, setting down her bag and taking the seat across from him. They sat in silence at first, the steam from the coffee rising between them, the morning light casting gentle shadows across the table. Graham found himself searching for the words, the right way to say what he needed to say, the fear of vulnerability pressing against his ribs, the old instinct to protect himself warring with the quiet determination that had begun to take root in him since the day he followed her. He told her then, carefully, about the donation, about the decision he had made to support the center, about the desire to do more, to help in a way that honored the work she was doing, to be part of something that mattered beyond the confines of his controlled world. Kayla listened, her eyes on him, her expression unreadable, her hands wrapped around the warm mug as she held it close. When he finished, the silence stretched, the weight of his words hanging between them, the fear that he had overstepped, that he had taken something from her, pressing into him with each second that passed. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady, thanking him for the support, acknowledging the help it had brought, but also telling him that the work she did was not charity, that it was not something to be saved by the wealth of someone who had never lived that struggle, that the people she helped were not problems to be solved, but lives to be respected, dignities to be protected. Her words struck him deeply, not as a rebuke, but as a reminder of the reality he was stepping into, of the responsibility that came with his desire to help, of the humility required to truly be part of something larger than himself. He nodded, accepting her words, promising her that he did not wish to control or overshadow, but to support, to stand beside her, to learn from her, to use what he had to build something meaningful, something that honored the dignity of the people she served. As the conversation ended, there was a new understanding between them, a fragile trust that had begun to form, the first tentative steps toward a partnership that neither of them had anticipated, but both felt the quiet promise of. Kayla returned to her work that day, but the air between them was different, lighter, the silence no longer heavy but filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of the path they had begun to walk together. That evening, Graham sat by the window, watching the city lights blink to life one by one. The darkness of the sky a deep canvas against which the small points of light seemed to pulse with quiet determination. He felt the emptiness within him, the space he had kept guarded for so long, beginning to fill, not with noise or chaos, but with a quiet hope, a sense of purpose that went beyond profit and loss, beyond control and security. It was a beginning, a small shift in a life that had been built around walls, a crack through which the light could finally enter, a promise that the fortress he had lived within did not have to remain a prison forever. For the first time in years, Graham felt the promise of something real, something worth the risk, something that made him believe that it was possible to change, to open himself to the world, to step beyond the safety of suspicion and fear, and into the uncertainty of connection, of trust, of purpose. And in that promise he found a quiet peace, the first he had known in a very long time. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was at once familiar and entirely new, a quiet shifting of the air in Graham's home that he felt with every step he took across the polished floors, and every breath he drew within the glass walls that had once felt like protection and now often felt like a suffocating shell. Each morning, Kayla arrived as she always had, her presence still gentle and careful, but the space between them had changed, filled now with the memory of that conversation in the kitchen, of the truths they had shared and the promises that had been made quietly, in the pauses between words, and the glances that lingered just a moment longer than before. The silence they once inhabited separately had become a shared space, and even though the words were still few, Graham found a sense of companionship in them that was foreign, but comforting. He began spending more time in the rooms where she worked, finding excuses to review a document at the dining table while she dusted the corners, to check messages near the living room while she vacuumed. He watched her hands as they moved with practiced ease, saw the small frown of concentration when she straightened a frame or adjusted a cushion, the way her eyes would sometimes lift to meet his before quickly dropping back to her task, a faint flush of color touching her cheeks. She did not speak much, but the small nods, the quiet acknowledgments of his presence, carried a warmth that filled spaces in him that had long remained empty. One afternoon, as the light streamed through the tall windows and pale, slanting beams that turned the dust motes into drifting stars, Graham found himself asking her about the community center, about the children she taught, about the families she helped. It was a hesitant question, spoken softly as if he feared that by voicing it, he might disturb the delicate balance that had formed between them. Kayla paused, the cloth in her hand stilling as she looked at him, her eyes searching his for a moment before she answered, her voice quiet but steady. She told him about the children who came after school, hungry not just for the food she brought, but for the attention, the kindness, the moments of learning that made them feel seen in a world that often overlooked them. She spoke of the elders who came with notebooks, determined to learn the words that would let them speak for themselves at the doctor's office, at the store, at their grandchildren's school. She spoke of the struggles, of the rent that always seemed just out of reach, of the repairs the building needed, of the nights she spent worrying over how to stretch the food to feed everyone who came. But as she spoke, Graham saw in her face not just the weight of responsibility, but the quiet light of purpose, the fierce determination that glowed even when her shoulders drooped with exhaustion. Listening to her, Graham felt the boundaries of his carefully maintained world continue to dissolve. The definitions he had clung to for so long, of success, of worth, of what it meant to live well, cracking under the weight of her simple, steadfast devotion to something larger than herself. He found himself drawn to the way she spoke, to the quiet conviction in her words, to the way her eyes brightened when she shared a story of a child learning to read, of an elder speaking their first full sentence in English without fear. In those moments, Graham felt the warmth of her purpose, a warmth that had begun to reach the cold places in him, places he had believed would remain untouched forever. As the days passed, he began to notice the ways in which his presence in her space was changing her as well. Kayla, who had always moved through his home with cautious efficiency, began to pause more often, to share small moments of her day, to let herself smile when she spoke of the center's small victories. She began to accept the cups of tea he offered when she took a short break, sitting with him at the kitchen table, the silence between them no longer heavy but gentle, filled with the soft hum of shared presence. Graham learned to listen, not to respond, not to solve, but simply to hear her, to let her words settle in the quiet, to let her know that her struggles, her hopes, her work mattered to someone else beyond the walls of that small building. There were moments, however, when Graham felt the old instincts rise, the need to fix, to control, to shield her from the difficulties she faced. One evening, he found himself researching grants, drafting proposals, reaching out to contacts who could provide support, driven by the desire to ease the burden she carried so quietly. But as he worked late into the night, the glow of the screen illuminating the lines of tension in his face, he paused, the memory of her words in the kitchen returning to him, reminding him that this was not about charity, not about him stepping in as a savior, but about standing beside her, respecting the dignity and agency of the people she served, respecting her commitment to them. He realized then that helping her, truly helping her, meant stepping into her world without trying to reshape it to fit his own ideas of efficiency and control. It meant offering support while accepting that the work, the mission, the community belonged to her and to those she served, that his role was not to lead but to walk alongside, to learn from the quiet strength she embodied. It was a lesson in humility, a breaking down of the walls of arrogance that had long kept him separate, a challenge to his deeply ingrained belief that control was the only way to protect himself from pain. The transformation within him was gradual, unfolding in small moments that accumulated like drops of rain, soft but persistent, until the landscape of his inner world was changed beyond recognition. He found himself thinking of the community center not as a place where he might extend his influence, but as a place of hope, of connection, of the quiet, resilient fight for dignity and opportunity. He imagined the faces of the children Kayla described, the elders learning to sign their names, the laughter that filled the rooms despite the peeling paint and creaking floors. He thought of Kayla moving among them, her gentle voice, her steady hands, her unwavering presence, and he felt a quiet pride in knowing her and witnessing her dedication. One day, as he watched her leave, her bag over her shoulder, her steps purposeful even in their tiredness, Graham made a decision. He would visit the center, not as a donor, not as a wealthy man seeking to inspect where his money had gone, but as a guest, as a learner, as someone who wanted to see for himself the place that had become the heart of her life, the place that had begun to shift the course of his own. He approached her the next morning, his voice careful as he expressed his wish, assuring her that he did not want to intrude, that he would only come if it was truly welcome. There was a moment of hesitation in her eyes, a flicker of something he could not quite name, before she nodded, agreeing to bring him on a day when he could see the center alive with the people it served. The day arrived with a clear sky, the air carrying the first warmth of spring as Graham drove through streets he rarely traveled, the city unfolding around him in neighborhoods he had only seen from a distance. The building that came into view was small, worn, the paint faded, the steps cracked, but there was a vibrancy in the way people moved in and out, children clutching books, elders chatting in small groups, laughter spilling into the street. Graham parked and stepped out, the sounds and scents of the neighborhood enveloping him, the hum of life immediate and real. Kayla met him at the door, her smile shy but genuine as she led him inside, introducing him to the volunteers, to the children who peered up at him with curious eyes, to the elders who nodded politely before returning to their workbooks. The rooms were filled with voices, with the soft murmur of learning, with the laughter of children, with the warmth of community that pulsed through the air like a quiet promise. Graham moved through the space carefully, observing, listening, feeling the texture of this world that was so different from his own. yet so full of the kind of life he had found himself craving. He watched Kayla as she moved among the people, her presence grounding, her attention focused on each person she spoke with, her hands guiding, encouraging, comforting. She was in her element here, alive in a way that made the quietness she wore in his home seem like a protective layer she could shed in this space among these people. Graham felt something shift within him as he witnessed it, a deepening of the respect he held for her, a quiet awe at the way she carried herself, at the way she gave so much of herself without expectation of recognition or reward. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, catching the dust in golden beams, Graham felt the walls within him breaking further, the final remnants of the fortress he had built around himself cracking under the gentle, persistent warmth of this place, of these people, of the woman who had brought him here. He realized that in this space there was no room for the cold calculations of profit and loss, no space for the guarded suspicion that had defined his interactions for so long. Here, there was only the quiet, persistent work of hope, of connection, of building something meaningful out of small, consistent acts of care. As he left that day, the sounds of the center echoing in his mind, Graham understood that he had stepped into a new chapter of his life, one that would be defined not by the walls he maintained, but by the connections he allowed, by the openness he embraced, by the quiet, persistent choice to stand beside those who fought each day to create light in the darkness. It was a choice he knew he would have to make again and again, each day a new commitment to remain open, to remain humble, to remain willing to learn. And as he drove away, the city moving around him, the sunlight reflecting off the buildings, Graham felt a peace within himself, a quiet certainty that for the first time in a long time he was exactly where he needed to be, on the path he was meant to walk, no longer hidden behind the walls of suspicion and fear, but moving forward into the warmth of a life defined by purpose, by connection, by the quiet, steady presence of a woman who had unknowingly shown him how to begin again. The days that followed Graham's visit to the community center seemed to unfold with a clarity he had not known in years, each morning arriving with a quiet sense of anticipation rather than the restless heaviness that used to greet him before dawn. The house remained the same in its structure, with its clean lines and muted colors, the echo of his footsteps against the polished floors still present. But it no longer felt like a fortress closing him in. It felt, instead, like a space being prepared for something else, something warmer and alive, though he could not yet name it fully, only feel its presence in the subtle changes that marked each passing day. Kayla continued her work in the home, moving through the rooms with the same gentle care she had always shown, but the silence between them had transformed into a companionable quiet. Graham found himself seeking moments to speak with her, to ask about the children at the center, about the elders learning to read, about the small victories she witnessed each day that had once seemed so distant from his world of investments and reports. She answered more freely now, her words carrying the softness of someone who felt seen, her eyes meeting his without the guarded caution they once held. In those moments, the home felt fuller, the air less heavy, the weight of unspoken fears and suspicions replaced by the calm that came from shared understanding. There were evenings when Graham would sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the lights of the city flicker against the darkening sky, and think of the center, of the laughter of the children, the soft murmur of lessons being learned, the gentle guidance Kayla offered as she moved among them. He thought of the elders, their hands weathered but steady as they practiced their writing, of the pride in their eyes when they formed words on the page, of the way Kayla's smile seemed to light up the room when she saw their progress. These thoughts no longer felt like intrusions into his carefully maintained world. They had become part of him, threads of warmth and purpose weaving into the fabric of his life. Graham began to find himself involved in the work of the center in small, quiet ways that respected the dignity Kayla had spoken of, ways that supported rather than overshadowed. He helped connect them with contacts who could provide affordable repairs to the building, ensuring the heating system was fixed before the colder months returned. He reached out to a friend who owned a local bookstore, arranging for a steady supply of books for the children's reading sessions. These acts were done without fanfare, without expectation of recognition, each one a conscious choice to participate in the work that mattered to her, to the community, and now to him. The partnership between them grew, not in grand declarations, but in the small, steady moments that accumulated like quiet affirmations of trust. There were mornings when Kayla would arrive with a tired smile, her eyes carrying the exhaustion of late nights spent organizing lessons and food drives, and Graham would offer her a cup of tea before she began her work. The simple act of care carrying with it the promise that she was not alone in her efforts. There were afternoons when they would sit together briefly, discussing ideas for the center, Kayla's voice steady as she shared her hopes, Graham's responses measured as he offered his support, learning to listen without imposing, to help without taking over. Through these moments, Graham began to see the reflection of the life his mother had once dreamed for him, not in the wealth he had accumulated, but in the purpose he was beginning to find. His mother's image, once a reminder of the loneliness he had chosen in his quest for security, became instead a gentle guide, a memory that urged him toward the warmth of connection, toward the quiet satisfaction that came from being part of something meaningful. In Kayla's dedication, in her unwavering commitment to her community, he saw the resilience his mother had embodied, the strength she had carried with quiet grace, and he felt closer to her than he had in years. The relationship between Graham and Kayla deepened as the season shifted, the air warming, the days stretching longer, the city coming alive with the promise of spring. They began to share more of themselves, the conversations moving beyond the center, beyond the immediate needs of the work they supported. Kayla spoke of her dreams of expanding the center's programs, of creating a space where families could find not just education but resources for employment, legal support, and a sense of belonging. Graham shared stories of his mother, the days he spent helping her in the small garden behind their apartment, of the promises he had made to himself in the quiet moments after she passed, promises that had led him to build walls he was now learning to dismantle. One afternoon, as they sat together after she had finished her work, Kayla shared a memory of her childhood in Honduras, of the evenings spent on the small porch with her mother, listening to the sounds of the village settling into night, the air filled with the scent of warm earth and cooking fires. She spoke of the way her mother's hand would rest on her shoulder, a steady presence that made her feel safe, even when the world around them was uncertain. Graham listened, seeing the soft smile on her face, the way her eyes grew distant as she spoke, and he felt the quiet honor of being trusted with these pieces of her past, with the memories that shaped the woman she had become. The trust between them grew into something deeper, a connection that went beyond the roles they had first occupied in each other's lives. It was not sudden, not marked by a single moment, but by a series of small instances where they allowed themselves to be seen, where the walls they each carried lowered just enough to let the other in. There was the morning when Graham found Kayla sitting in the kitchen, her head resting in her hands, the weight of exhaustion and worry visible in the slump of her shoulders. And without a word, he sat beside her, offering silent companionship until she lifted her head, her eyes meeting his with gratitude. There was afternoon when Kayla found Graham in his office, the papers spread out before him, his gaze distant as he struggled with the quiet fear of change, and she placed a hand gently on his arm, grounding him in the present, reminding him that he was not alone. As spring settled fully over the city, the community center held a small gathering to celebrate the completion of the repairs and the expansion of its programs, a moment of joy for the families who found safety within its walls. Graham attended, standing quietly at the edge of the room as children laughed and played, as elders shared stories, as volunteers moved among the guests with plates of food and cups of sweet coffee. He watched Kayla, her face glowing with quiet happiness as she greeted each person, her presence a steady comfort in the bustling room, and he felt the warmth of pride and affection swell within him, a feeling so strong and clear that it left him momentarily breathless. As the evening drew to a close, Kayla found him standing near the door, her smile soft as she approached, her eyes reflecting the gentle lights strung across the ceiling. They stood together in the quiet that settled after the laughter faded, the room slowly emptying as families gathered their children, as volunteers began to clean up, as the hum of conversation lowered to a comforting murmur. In that moment, Graham turned to her, the words he had carried for weeks finding their way to the surface, spoken softly but firmly, telling her how much her work, her presence, had changed him, how she had brought warmth into the cold corners of his life, how she had shown him the strength of kindness, the power of purpose. Kayla listened, her eyes glistening, her hand reaching for his, their fingers intertwining in a quiet affirmation of the connection that had grown between them, a connection built on trust, on shared purpose, on the courage to step beyond fear into the uncertain but promising light of something real. They stood together as the last of the guests left, the community center quieting around them, the air filled with the soft echo of the day's laughter and the gentle promise of tomorrow. In the weeks that followed, Graham and Kayla began to shape a new path together, one that honored the work they both valued, one that allowed them to build a life rooted in purpose and shared dreams. They worked side by side, expanding the programs at the center, creating opportunities for families to find stability and hope, for children to learn and grow, for elders to reclaim their voices. They spent evenings planning fundraisers, writing grant proposals, reaching out to community leaders, each task carried out with the quiet joy of knowing they were building something that mattered, something that would continue to grow, something that was bigger than either of them alone. In the quiet moments, when the day's work was done, they found comfort in each other's presence, sharing stories, laughter, and the simple peace of companionship that came from knowing they no longer had to carry their burdens alone. Graham discovered a joy in the ordinary moments, making coffee for Kayla in the morning, walking together through the neighborhood after a long day, sharing a meal while discussing the plans for the week ahead. Kayla found a steady support in Graham's presence, in his willingness to listen, to learn, to offer his resources not as a means of control but as a gift of trust and partnership. Their lives became intertwined, not in a way that erased their individual identities, but in a way that honored who they were, who they had been, and who they were becoming together. It was not a fairy tale, not without challenges and moments of doubt, but it was real, grounded in the quiet, persistent choice to trust, to care, to continue the work that had brought them together. One evening, as they stood by the window in Graham's home looking out over the city that shimmered with the lights of countless stories unfolding, Kayla rested her head against his shoulder, her hand in his, and they stood in a silence that was full. the kind of silence that speaks of peace, of contentment, of the quiet certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Graham turned to look at her, seeing the strength and kindness that had first drawn him in, seeing the woman who had shown him the way back to himself, and he knew without doubt that this was the life he wanted, a life built not behind walls, but in the open, in the warmth of connection, in the light of purpose and love. The fortress he had once built around himself was gone, replaced by the open spaces of a life shared, a life lived with intention and care. And as they stood together, watching the city breathe and glow beneath the night sky, Graham felt the quiet, profound joy of a man who had found his way home. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out the other videos on the channel and feel free to share this video with someone who might need it. Thank you for watching.